The Soviet Union proudly presented itself as a nation made up of equal republics and peoples, but from the outside it was often viewed as a Russo-centric empire, in which the diktats from Moscow were violently enforced upon the periphery. So which was it? Was the Soviet Union really a union, or was it just another Russian empire? Now, empire is obviously quite difficult to define, but if the USSR were a Russian empire, then it would have some features similar to other empires. It would of course have a metropole from which many decisions were made on behalf of people that had no say there. Wealth would flow from the periphery to the centre, at which there would be a single ethnic group which would benefit the most. This group would then also export or force their own language and culture onto those under their control and would use violence to prevent them from leaving. So to what extent did these things exist in the USSR? Well, obviously that depends on which period is being looked at. In the early years, the new Soviet government was kind of a mess. It tried to reinvent the way that government worked whilst also having to run the country using the old administration from the Russian Empire. After things had settled and Lenin had been thoroughly mummified, Stalin was in charge and he had plans. Now, Stalin considered himself an expert on ethnicity and culture within the USSR, and so he sought to head off any potential upsets. He himself was Georgian, but that didn't mean that he was opposed to the centrality of the Russian people and language within the USSR. Lenin had previously ordered that local languages be taught across the country, whereas Stalin wanted to make sure that Russian was still the central language of communism. The idea being that local identities were fine, but a collective identity was needed and would be created through the teaching of Russian. In terms of economics, the USSR was fairly even-handed when it came to things like infrastructure. Things like factories were often built outside of Russia proper, which brought a lot of money and jobs to the regions around. Furthermore, the internal borders of the USSR were often adjusted along ethnic lines, which led to Russia losing territory to its sister socialist republics. In terms of how much freedom the non-Russian governments had, it was mixed. Now obviously everyone was subject to the same Stalinist repression. However, if a leader of a republic was a close friend with Stalin, then they would give him much more individual freedom on how to run the place. If Stalin didn't like you, oh boy. And he didn't really like the Baltic states. These three had been independent for over 20 years by the time the USSR annexed them, and to put it bluntly, they weren't happy with this new arrangement. As such, Stalin made sure to relocate Russians to the Baltics to make sure that there was always a population loyal to Moscow. A similar story applied to the territories Moscow gained from Poland in 1945. Many Ukrainians and Poles were forcibly removed from their homelands, and those that resisted either ended up in the gulags or pits. So, did running a country centred in Russia benefit Russia and the Russians? Well, yes, depending on where in Russia you were exactly. For many of those living across Russia, especially the east, their lives weren't that much better than those living in, say, Georgia or Belarus. Wages were based on what sector you worked in, but for the most part, those that lived in Moscow or Leningrad were much better off. And this was the case across most of the life of the USSR. Whilst Russia held greater prestige at the centre of the USSR, its people lived similar lives to those in the rest of the country. For many of those who lived outside of Russia, the USSR certainly felt like a Russian empire, but the beneficiaries of this empire weren't the Russian ethnicity, but those who lived in major cities all across the Soviet Union. I hope you enjoyed this episode, with a special thanks to my patrons: James Bizanet, Kelly Moneymaker, Sky Chappelle, Katoitska, Yuduan Wang, Anthony Beckett, Marcus Arsner, Rod D. Martin, YN Hockey, AF Firefly, Spencer Lightfoot, Gustav Swan, Captain Psydog, Alex Schwinn, Shuenin, The McWhopper, Marvin Cassow, Spinning 3 Plates, Andy McGeehee, Copper Tone, Calling Dr. Howard, Dr. Fine, Dr. Howard, Maggie Patskowski, Kamoon Yoon, Winston Kaywood, Jim Stromberg, Remco Husman, Miss Izette, Charles I, and Words About Books podcast.